Kilometer by kilometer, I use kilometers, not miles, I'm Canadian. We build equality. This isn't just a slogan. This is a mantra by how I live my life, whether running over the mountains, through war zones, or alongside other women who dare to move when society tells them that they shouldn't. A few years ago, I entered a race called Tour de Glacier. This is a 450-kilometer non-stop race in the Italian Alps. It has 32,000 meters of climbing, which is the equivalent of 4 Everests, and it is unmarked, so you have to navigate your way throughout the whole course. There's 180 hours on the clock. That's about a week long. And you can choose to sleep if you want, but the clock keeps ticking the whole time, so there's constant pressure to keep moving. If you think it sounds impossible, it's because it was. Now, only 2 women had ever finished this race before. And the year that I was competing, there were only 2 other women on the start line. I wanted to do something with my performance that showed everyone that we not only belonged out there in the mountains, on the tough passes, in the middle of the night, on the snowy passes, but we would thrive there. Now, the only way to do a race like this that's 450 kilometers is to do it 1 kilometer at a time. I couldn't think about 450 kilometers all at once. That was crazy. I'd never run that far before in my life. So all I could think about was getting to the next checkpoint, the next kilometer, or the next step. The only way to cover impossible ground is 1 step at a time. I'm Stephanie Case. I am a human rights lawyer, an ultramarathon runner, which you might have picked up means running distances longer than a marathon, and I'm also the founder of Free to Run, which is a nonprofit organization that advances gender equity through leadership and running programs for women and girls in areas of conflict like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Palestine. Now today, I want to share with you 3 lessons that I've picked up about chasing impossible goals and what that means for all of us here in the room working to advance gender equity in sport. So the first lesson is that impossible doesn't actually mean that something isn't possible. It just means that no one's tried it yet. No one has found the solution, and every impossible goal is waiting for the right person to try it. This was me some years ago. I wasn't a blonde back then, when I got my first job with the United Nations in Afghanistan. And this was my dream job. I know, it sounds strange. But this was also at the start of my ultra running career. And people told me that I would have to quit running. And I was so frustrated. I'd finally gotten the best job of my life. And people told me I'd have to give up my passions. But I understood where they were coming from. I was living within the confines of an armed compound. I wasn't allowed to go outside of the compound on foot, only by armored vehicle. And the longest stretch of road was just 600 meters. Not ideal training ground for running ultramarathons. I could also hear gunshots, explosions outside of the compound walls every day. This is a photo of how we got in and out of the compound every day, in the armored vehicles, weaving around these concrete barriers, because this is the best way and the most effective way to slow down potential suicide attackers. It was a reminder for me of the dangers that we faced on a daily basis. But 600 meters isn't a lot, but it's enough. If you can walk, you can run. And I explored every nook and cranny of that compound. I ran along the shipping containers. I lived in one of the shipping containers. I ran along the shipping containers. I ran alongside the blast wall, around the barbed wire. I pulled tires to try to simulate training, running up hills. I did everything I could to be able to get my training in. For those of you that use Strava, this is what my Strava segments looked like. You can see there were a lot of loops and a lot of back and forth. But I trained for 3 ultramarathons that year, raising money for a local women's shelter. And it was actually in getting to know the women at the shelter that the idea for Free to Run was born. The Afghan women I met wanted to do all of the things that I got to do so freely. I thought I was restricted being in the compound, but actually I wasn't. I was quite privileged. The Afghan women wanted to know how they could do the running as well. And the idea for me was so incredibly daunting, because not only are they facing the dangers of war, of the bombs, of the gunshots, of the attacks, but also all of the social and cultural norms, the discrimination, the aspects that largely confine them to the home. How on earth was I going to start a running program in that situation? So I spent a year talking to other organizations, other nonprofit organizations, seeing if they could incorporate more sports programming for women. There were some indoor volleyball games, there were a few ad hoc things going on, but everyone told me the same thing: it's impossible. And I knew that what the women were asking for was not indoor volleyball games, as good as those might be. They wanted to go outside, running freely. And for me, I was curious to see, is there a way that we can use running to actually not just benefit the women, but also change those underlying social cultural norms, those ideas that prevented women from being able to run freely in the first place? So I was able to raise a few $1,000s, and with that, I created a week of running and leadership programs. Now, I had about 12 women from one of the universities in the Central Highlands region of Afghanistan come show up on the first day, and I should show you actually a photo of what they look like, but they were wearing long black dresses, high heels, ballet flats, purses. They had never been hiking before in their lives, and I thought, oh, what am I getting myself in for? But within a few hours, that was them. They were climbing up exposed ridgelines. We were crawling through ice caves. They were using their headscarves to pull one another up the mountain pass, literally seeing their lives from a different perspective, from above. And I knew that we were onto something then. Over the years that surpassed, we expanded to 5 different provinces in Afghanistan, including Kandahar, one of the most conservative regions where the Taliban had quite a stronghold. And we were really finding safe and bold ways for women to reclaim public space, because it is in actually going and moving through outdoors that it changed the ideas of the roles that women can and should be playing in society. That photo there on the upper left-hand corner was of the first woman, Zainab, to complete a marathon in Afghanistan, and I had the privilege of running alongside her. That year, there was 1 woman. The next year, there were 6, and then 12, and then 40, with hundreds more young girls participating in a 10K race. It was incredible, and just going better than I ever thought. But that brings me to the second lesson, which is that when you strive for impossible goals, you have to get comfortable with failure. This photo was taken when I was back in Afghanistan in July 2021, just a few weeks before the Taliban took over the country. We knew that the security situation was deteriorating. We had activated contingency plans in place. We were burning documents with sensitive information. We were supporting our staff to come from the provinces to Kabul, where we thought it was safer. But then on August 15th, 2021, the Taliban walked into Kabul, and it caused panic. For us, for an organization, an international organization working on women's and girls' rights, we knew that our staff was potentially at risk. We had 45 staff members and their families, which was over 100 people, most of whom didn't have passports, none of whom had visas, and we had to figure out ourselves, how do we get them potentially to safety? Again, another impossible task. At that time, the Taliban had set up checkpoints leading up to the airport. Different international militaries were guarding different gates of the airport, and the rules became all the more strict after an ISIS attack killed over a dozen US Marines. We had to find our own safe houses, get our own cash. There was a run on the banks, find our own transport, figure out how to negotiate our way into an airport, and then find our own planes. But I'm happy to say, with the support of the Ukrainian Special Forces, who were there just months before their own country was invaded, we were able to get all of our staff and their family members who wanted to risk taking that journey out to safety. Now, as hard as that was, it was even harder to watch Afghan women disappear from view overnight. Within days, the Taliban's rules started to come into play. Girls cannot attend school after primary school. Women can largely not go to work. They're even banned from working for the UN. And they can't go outside without a mahram, a male chaperone, and without a burqa. There's even been recent rules about how they have to cover one eye underneath the burqa. This is a photo here of what the streets looked like, where someone went around graffitiing even just the faces of Afghan women on billboards. They were literally becoming invisible again. So how do we continue Free to Run? A program that's based on running outdoors, supporting women in sports. When women were banned from sports, they're largely banned from being outside. Again, it sounded impossible, but I knew that we had to find a way to continue to support the thousands of women and girls who had gone through our programs and were desperate to maintain that connection. So we maintained a foothold, a toehold, some people might call it. We started again indoors with trauma-informed movement, yoga, meditation, sometimes online, sometimes in person. And since then, month by month, year by year, we've been able to find opportunities in secret, underground, where we've been able to go back outside. I can't show you photos of that, but you'll have to take my word for it. We've also been able to expand our programs in Iraq, where we're supporting people who've been internally displaced from the war, refugees from Syria, members of ethnic minorities like the Yazidis. We have also expanded to Palestine, working with a local partner, Palestine Sports for Life, helping to support women and girls in unimaginable circumstances in not just the West Bank, but also Gaza. And that brings me to the third lesson, which is that when you chase after impossible goals, you discover extraordinary things. So all of these lessons that I've learned from Free to Run, I've taken into my personal life. After 3 years of battling through pregnancy loss, infertility, multiple rounds of IVF, I was lucky enough to greet my daughter, Pepper, last November. Now, again, I had given up running largely. I'd given up competition for those 3 years, and that was my identity. I was able to keep running, in war zones in Afghanistan, but through the pregnancy loss and the grief, I found it incredibly difficult. So I was desperate to come back to running as soon as I had my daughter. And of course, people told me, it's going to be hard, you won't be able to do it right away, But I wanted to try. And so these are photos of some of my training runs, where my partner would bring Pepper out to me while I was on a run so that I could feed her. Or again, I was doing different kinds of loops, but I was doing loops around my home so that I'd be able to feed Pepper mid-run. And I trained and I trained and I trained, and I thought, why not sign up for another race? So I signed up for this race in Wales, Ultra Trail Snowdonia. It was just 100 kilometers with 6,500 meters of climbing, and I would be competing about 6 months postpartum. Now, because I'd been out of competition for so long, I had lost my ranking. I had lost my place in the sport, and so I couldn't start in the first wave or the second wave. I was starting in the last starting wave, about 30 minutes behind the elites. And I thought, okay, well, if I'm starting 30 minutes behind everyone else, I'm just going to go out and have fun. I don't need to worry about competing. So I fed Pepper at the 20-kilometer checkpoint, the 50-kilometer checkpoint, the 80-kilometer checkpoint. I was having a great time, eating watermelon. Made it to the finish, and discovered I'd won. Now, I had no idea that I was actually that far up in the course because I'd started so far back, and there were women in front of me, but I had actually made up that time, and they made me actually go back. This is a reenactment because the first place women who had started half an hour before me had already broken the tape, so I had to go back and then reenact the finish, which was quite fun. And it wasn't about being the fastest. It was about refusing to accept that motherhood and endurance were incompatible. So that one photo of me breastfeeding at the 80-kilometer checkpoint went viral. And that little bit of magic, that little bit of extraordinary that I found out on that race course, it spread. And it spread to moms all over the world. And they reached out to me telling me about the adventures that they had done that just hadn't been photographed, or the ones that they were now inspired to do. So I want to bring you back to that race I was talking about at the beginning, Tour de Glacier. I battled through that race. You can see the look on my face. It took me 155 hours to finish, 155 hours and 6 minutes. And I only had 4.5 hours in total of sleeping. That's 4.5 hours over 6.5 days. But in doing so, I was not only the first woman, but I broke the course record by over a day. And I was third overall. So third on the men's podium, which was pretty fun. Thank you. But this is even better. What I think is so cool about this race and what happened, oh, we still there, is that this year, just a few weeks ago, a grandmother broke that course record by another few hours. And I couldn't have been happier, because that is what progress is. So I want to leave you with a thought today. All of us in this room, and there are some incredible people coming up on the panels. As we're working towards gender equity in sport, I want you to remember that every impossible goal is filled with thousands of possible ones, and you just need the courage to be able to take the next step. Thank you so much.